Today on the Glad Trad podcast, I sit down and talk with Dermot Curtin, who is a great scholar in his own right of the Scriptorium project, which is a fantastic undertaking that seeks to preserve the texts of Christian antiquity, that's from the time of the apostles all the way through the High Middle Ages, and present them to us accessible in English and online. We're going to have a very great talk about the importance of Christian patristics, as well as cultural preservation across time, and most importantly, how the heck does one sneak into the Vatican Archives? Hey, a huge shout out to all of our patrons who make this show possible. Go on over to thegladchildpodcast.com/Patreon if you would like to support the show. And please don't forget to like, comment, and to share this episode far and wide. Now, without further ado, this is the Glad Trad Podcast.
It's going down.
How's it going, everybody? This is Jordan Pacheco from the Glad Trad Podcast. I hope you're doing well, and we have a really cool episode today. It's going to be a great conversation. I'm here with a relatively new friend, Dermot Curtin, who is behind a really cool place called the Scriptorium project. And I don't want to kind of set the table too wide, but the Scriptorium project, as far as I can tell, Dermot, it is a really cool resource you are compiling where it's taking a lot of the patrimony of, I think I was reading on your website, antiquity, the 4th century to the 15th century, so many manuscripts and documents from all over different parts of the church, and kind of compiling it in English, some of these sources. But I want you to set the table and give everyone the broad salvo, because for myself, and I think for a lot of our listeners and viewers, this will be kind of a good opening of patristics, which of course is what your work entails.
Oh, absolutely. So I guess giving a definition for patristics for people who aren't familiar with it. So patristics obviously comes from pater, the Latin for fathers. It deals with a lot of the works relating to the early church, people who are relatively salient that we talk about to this day. If you drive around to local parishes, there's usually quite a few familiar names that come up in terms of patristics. When we were talking before the show, about being trained by Augustinian monks. Clearly, St. Augustine is a major figure in the history of Western patristics. All of these documents kind of create what's known as the tradition within the Catholic Church. So we have this sense of the scriptures themselves, but tradition's a little bit more nebulous. It's not a single document or even a collection of documents. It's this vast array of documents, and trying to have access to them has been kind of a lifelong struggle here. So they do exist. They are sitting in a lot of places in open site and libraries. A lot of them aren't accessible because of the language barrier that exists. Now, thankfully, a lot of them have been compiled historically in single Latin texts. And if you are familiar with Latin, both in the vulgar or classical sense, it's there. It's just that kind of education is missing anymore. Classical Latin education, even within Catholic universities, Catholic high schools, is just vanished.
Yeah.
And like whatever presence it had in public and private sectors has gone the way of the dodo as well.
So let me even ask you this, because, you know, when you say something like, oftentimes there's a language barrier, right? It's kind of in these disparate places. So to centralize it, I'm obviously on this show, we talk a lot about Catholic culture and traditional Catholicism, and we kind of hit it from that angle. And I work at an Augustinian institute, so, you know, shout out to St. Augustine. But it's just funny to me, even just thinking about, you know, that we have this great, I love even the root word, right, patrimony of the church, but it already has been unpolished. So of all people, what about patristics, even just in general, got you into it? Because it's not something that you usually say is your calling card, I can imagine.
So I remember even going back into high school, we had to do some initial project. I think I was probably maybe 14 or 15. And we were directed to newadvent.com, which is a fairly well-known website. And it has a long listing of some of the church fathers there. And most of the big ones, in terms of their major works, you can find there. There's, in terms of the Latin fathers, Cyprian and Augustine and Jerome and Ambrose. Again, names that should be fairly familiar to any Catholic, but that's a relatively short list. So what was happening, let's say, outside of that? Because there's the era kind of classically of the high church during the late Roman Empire in the West.
Yeah.
But what about works of the medieval church, like St. Albert the Great? What about works when the church was kind of coming into its own during the Dark Ages? Those were all kind of missing. And the collection that is at newadvent.com is a fantastic one. It was compiled by Catholic and Protestant scholars probably at the end of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a really incomplete one. It's one that doesn't really have a full universal picture of the church. Some of that is just they're working from a relatively narrow mindset. They call the ante-Nicene Fathers. And other ones is the other part of the language barrier, which we have a lot of texts that are in Latin, but if they're not in Latin, you're not going to have access to them. So the world of any kind of Greek text or anything involving an Eastern language is totally unknown to us. So whole works of significant, they call doctors of the church, who wrote in Greek, who spoke in Greek, some of their works are available. Think of St. John Chrysostom or John of Damascus, really pivotal figures in the history of Christianity that, in my opinion, don't quite get a fair shake because of the language barrier that exists. And there's ones that are a little bit even more exotic than that.
Did you find that? So I think about you talking about, of course, it makes sense that there was a sort of preservation thanks to Latin for some of the Western part of the church, but for the Eastern, do you find when you kind of do your research that any of these sort of patristics are written in something like Church Slavonic, even thinking of Saint Cyril and Methodius, or do you find it kind of more strictly Greek from the time of the Byzantines or something like
Uh, so that's a two-part question here.
that?
The first one is the frustrating part, which is even when documents are in Greek, Greek, much like the English language, isn't a static thing.
Mm.
Like my initial training was Greek, was in Athanase, the Greek that was spoken during like the height of the Athenian Empire in
Hmm.
antiquity. That's very different from, let's say, the Koine Greek spoken by Christ, still intelligible, but a little bit of a jump to the medieval Greek, and then modern Greek is like this whole different entity altogether. Um, Trying to be able to work with that barrier because there's plenty of classical schools out there, but working with the medieval Greek is a real challenge, and usually I need some significant backup to make that happen, which is part of the reasons why those texts have just not been touched.
Hmm.
I've been very lucky. There was a scholar, a French Jesuit, Jacques Mignet, who in the 19th century had compiled a lot of these works, both from their Byzantine manuscripts, and then he also, fortunately, made a lot of those works available in Latin. So a lot of the body of those works, even if they're originally written in Greek, on my end are really drawn from the Latin translation manuscripts. The other ones, languages that exist outside of the sphere of classic language, like Latin and Greek, um, those are the tough ones.
Mm.
Old Church Slavonic is still used liturgically within several rites within the Orthodox Church. It's just it's not a common language. No one's speaking it.
Right.
There are some texts that I've made available that have been done through scholars who do speak things like Georgian, Ukrainian, and Russian. Those are relatively accessible languages that I have access to scholars who can work with me on that. I'm not doing the heavy lifting, thank God, because I don't understand, uh, especially East Slavic languages at all. The whole subject-verb agreement is very, very different from what we would understand in the West. But those are also documents. Like I grew up never hearing anything about what was the conversion of Georgia like under St. Nino. It was just kind of like this passing reference that had happened, but really let's get back to France and Italy and Spain.
Hmm. Wow. Goodness. Okay. I'm like, I'm trying to, oh man, I'm trying to capture because something that you said in there that I do really want to unpack. So, even before we do that, let's even just take a wider step back. So, let me get your fluency down real quick. Latin and Greek, and you said what I wanted to get to is that you said where you have a strength, obviously, in understanding the Greek of antiquity. Medieval Greek is tricky for you, and usually I would think it would be the opposite for people. That somehow the closer you get to our time, that the easier it would be to kind of draw from that language instead of going backwards.
So the interesting thing about medieval Greek is that there's so much insertion of idioms. So
Idioms. Yeah.
when it comes to biblical translation, that becomes a major issue
Mm.
because there's a lot of talk of literalism in translation, but that never actually really works out.
Mm.
So I think of the fifth chapter of St. Mark there, the Gerzemin demoniac. Usually, if you go to most Bibles, the demoniac says something like, "What would you have of me, Jesus?" Something to that effect.
Hmm.
But that's not there in the Greek. The Greek is way more ambiguous. It would translate to something like, "What of you and me?" Or even like you see it all the time. And the beauty of the line comes from Jerome's Vulgate a few centuries later. But the Greek, "Imai gotos stregos te zoues." Normally, I am the bread of life.
Hmm.
There's a lot of ambiguity that's available in those lines alone. First off, the way that it's written is clearly from John's gospel, because Christ constantly refers to himself as I am. But other words like using bread, I mean, it, it can be used as bread, but it's not necessarily exclusively as bread. Or even with the word zoes, which does mean life, but it's something specific, not life in a generic sense like bios,
Hmm.
but animal life specifically. It's our root for the word zoo. In every attempt to try to make a translation, there's always some level of personal choice, or it's it's extending well beyond interpretation. You're trying to be able to make sense of exactly what's taking place given the limited context. And the limited cultural context for me, as someone who is not living within the medieval Eastern Roman Empire, is
Uh-huh.
relatively challenging. So it does require some understanding. And for biblical translators themselves, delving into the ancient Hebrew, it's even more complicated, specifically for that idiomatic reason. That we don't, certain things there are no literal translations for.
So does it, can you read therefore when you go to the Bible, do you just skip the middleman and just read it in, well, Greek, I suppose, and then Latin after if you have to?
Well, so the New Testament's very interesting when you read it in Greek. I suppose in the translation, some of the personality is clearly lost. Saint Mark, as it's written, is a really interesting text, and no one's quite sure of this whether he was originally writing in Biblical Aramaic and Syriac, or that he was writing in Greek and he's just really bad at Greek, as opposed to maybe a little bit more refined. Clearly, Luke, even in the tradition, is supposed to be a physician. His Greek is a little bit more refined.
Hmm.
Mark tends to kind of make up words when he's not really sure what to
Oh,
do.
really? Okay. Wow.
Uh, the final book, John of Patmos, is, is quite a challenge. They usually don't even give it to graduate students in Greek because he's all over the place.
Hmm.
But something like the 16th Vulgate. So Jerome was a pretty bright guy, and in words that he uses in his translation, he's drawing a lot of allusion to Plato and Platonic literature,
Mm.
which I mean you can say is kind of in the Greek, but he's clearly selecting words there to be able to use those two, which would kind of be the forerunner to the later scholastic movement, where we're taking classical philosophy from the Greeks and Romans and trying to fuse it with biblical revelation. Uh, Jerome's kind of like the forefront, the crest of all of that, especially with his Vulgate, which is why it was so popular in academic circles for almost 1,000 years.
Well, there's a kind of a realization, right, that we're talking about something that a lot of people would agree, well, even just broader than Western culture, but certainly becomes the fabric for a lot of Western culture. And I think we've sort of lost, right, this realization that once upon a time you did have this stronger fabric. Certainly language was a little bit more united. If you were to be an educated man of, let's say, the Middle Ages, chances are you probably spoke both your vernacular, read your vernacular, and also would have spoke Latin, certainly, and probably some Greek therein. uh, it's gone a little, it's obviously gone away. I think that there is a great resurgence, or a good resurgence of classical education. And uh, it's funny that when we're talking about Greek, one of our professors at the Augustine Institute, of course, I get to look over the students' shoulders at their introductory to Greek course and introductory to the New Testament in Greek. And and so you said something interesting talking about wordplay and how when it comes to the translation and even just going through the ancient texts, there's a question of the literal translation that might lose the character, and then maybe more character translation that perhaps could lose the literal. As far as your work kind of goes, is there a particular side that you sort of err on, or do you find that there isn't really as much of a conflict when it comes to trying to translate any of these ancient texts?
It's a good question. So unfortunately, I'm uh, somewhat limited in my scope, both in terms of the selection of texts that I'm pulling from and in terms of avoiding any kind of idiomatic issue. So idioms are culturally specific, right? There are things that we say here within the English speaking world that they don't necessarily translate well. They don't even exist in other types of English.
Yeah, I have a coworker, an animator from Mexico, and I think that the term we were trying to say is you don't look a gift horse in the mouth.
Yeah.
And there is in English already for some people they struggle, but it really does make sense. There's not a one-to-one translation in Spanish. It doesn't quite. You could literally do it, but it completely would lose what exactly we're trying to say.
Yeah. So sometimes there's like a proverbial level that makes sense to you in the context of that culture.
Mm.
But once you take it out of the culture, it's challenging. And with a lot of these documents, especially ones where there's a mixed sense of cultural fusion. So I think of St. John of Damascus, who is speaking within a Byzantine world, but also a very Syriac world.
Yeah.
I don't have his Syriac text, and God knows, even if I did, I wouldn't be able to do anything with it. But he's still speaking to an audience that understands the idioms of medieval Syria. Um, every so often, there's something that's like I don't quite know what to do with that, um, because it's clear from the reading of the text that the intention is something other than literal. But because of my own scholarly limitations, I just have to leave it as being a very literal reading. Now, I recognize that that might not be doing full justice to the text itself, but also uh, recognizing the scholarly limitations that exist. And those exist universally. I can't be able to perfectly align this to probably the intention of the author, but this is kind of the first wave of scholarship for texts that are otherwise unavailable.
So give me a rundown of how you're approaching with the Scriptorium project. So even just looking at your website, which I've admittedly been going over for the past couple of weeks and kind of getting a sense of who you are and what you're doing. I love the breakdowns here from the Celtic Church, the Anglo-Saxon, the Punic Church, which of course raises my eyebrows. And so I just want to know, where do you get kind of your text that you're going to translate and sort of work over from, and is your ultimate goal, is it to be that centralized resource? Is that what's missing that you've sort of found, that we just don't have a place to go when we're trying to understand the great patrimony of the church? And this is it, this can actually be the resource point, hopefully the starting point, right, for so much of what we've lost.
Yeah. So this is intended to fill a little bit of a gap here. Some of it is a mutual point of frustration that within the world of apostolic Christianity, no one reads anyone else's text. So, like, there are distinctively Catholic texts, and Orthodox texts, and even Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox texts,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't talk to each other. It's
Mm.
like they exist in a vacuum, which is very strange to me. Because if we're talking about going back to an initial point, we talk about people like Athanasius. Uh, clearly, he's going to have a major impact on all three of those worlds. Some of the uh, theological suppositions that he put forward have had ripple effects across the centuries. He's not a Coptic figure. He's not a Catholic figure. He's not an Orthodox figure. So, in a certain sense, there is some ecumenical value that's attached to that. Other ones you'd mentioned, like the Punic Church, which I always found very fascinating because it wasn't really discussed.
Mm-hmm.
This whole sense of North African Christianity, which disappeared in the same way that North African Latin, the African Romance language, vanished sometime in the high medieval period. So, what was that like? What was their specific tradition? Some of it is recoverable. Now, the sources for it, unfortunately, are few and far between. So, with major sources, there are reproductions of ancient texts. The Society of Bollandists, they usually have a quarterly article for the last century and a half. The Analecta Bollandiana. There is the Patriligia Latina, Gracia and Syriaca and Orientalis. All of those are fabulous reproductions of those texts. There is some qualm about their not their authenticity, but their validity, since most of them were brought over to Rome after the fall of the Roman Empire. So, how legitimate are they in terms of their original source? That I can't speak to.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's another scholarly limitation. But as it stands right now, there's really no one else who's doing this, so it's the only show in town. Trying to remember the thread of your question right now. I'm sorry.
No, no, not at all. I was just mentioning that, looking, and you even just talked about a little bit the Punic Church, which the reason why it raised my eyebrows is the last time, honestly, for me, outside anyone's kind of general understanding of the life of St. Augustine, I think about the Punic Church is, I do some amateur military history. So I think about, once upon a time, Belisarius set foot out in ancient Carthage to go help on his way to go reclaim Rome for the Emperor Justinian. And then past that, of course, we don't even, the Islamic conquest happens later in the High Middle Ages you talk about. But I was just even thinking about culturally what kind of texts exist. And broadly speaking, to something that you said, to talk about, we have these different kind of hotspots in the apostolic age. And so you do have obviously saints and figures that are more understood in Oriental Christianity and in Eastern Christianity and in Western Christianity. Is there a sort of through thread that you're discovering in your scholasticism? Are you finding kind of some clues about what it was like to have that apostolic age, how Christianity would have spread? If there's maybe some ideas you can maybe see them travel together, or do you find that they are already kind of growing a little bit more disparate as we sort of think of them today?
I think Christianity can only really be understood in its own cultural milieu.
Hmm.
And part of the reason for breaking up the church, because I'll talk about it as this singular entity, into all these different entities is just that. So the way that the appearance of the Punic Church is going to, or did appear, is radically different from the way that it appeared in Egypt or Greece or in Italy. All of them have to speak the cultural understanding of their times and the people immediately around. And sometimes that comes out in questions of language. You mentioned Cyril and Methodius. Their big innovation was speaking to the Slavs in their own native tongue and making a distinctively Slavic church, which would be more comprehensible intellectually for the Slavs to come into. And once they did that, the Slavic people grabbed hold of it and have held on to it for the last 13th century.
Mm-hmm.
I think to some degree that's been missing quite a bit. It has been a cultural and linguistic barrier that probably has caused so much of the fragmentation that we've seen. And we see that with the edicts and canons that come out of church councils, that there's almost this like shockwave that follows them, where there's a translation and somebody slips up and it causes a whole bunch of tension that didn't need to happen. We saw it after Chalcedon with the Egyptians and the Greeks. We saw it after Second Nicaea, the Latin and Greek world. If we're able to speak to that and address it, that Christianity as a common thread is fine, and that it can be understood, that it can be malleable a little bit, depending upon the culture that receives it. Now, clearly, there's a line between culturally malleable and just totally heterodox, right?
Right.
There are certain things that were just not acceptable. Say that when Francis Xavier came to India, the St. Thomas Christians would trace their origin back 15 centuries to Thomas himself, who was there in the flesh on Mount Kenai. And that's a tremendous tradition. They had a specific cultural milieu which Christianity was accepted in. But there was clearly also heterodoxy that it introduced because of the broader Hindu culture, things like reincarnation, which don't have anything to do with Christianity. It required some level of reform. A lot of people have questioned how much is reasonable reform and how much is just blotting out the culture altogether. It's a good question. I don't have a clear answer for it.
Well, that's what makes for the best conversations. Thank God for us. Huh? What is your educational background? And what was the spark, if there was a spark, that set you off into doing exactly what you're doing?
So my undergrad was at Villanova,
Okay.
theology. I was a theology student there as a graduate student for a while afterwards as well. Couldn't pay the bills as a layman in theology. Um, that that's a hard thing to be able to do. So eventually, I transferred out and did the rest of my graduate work, including my doctorate in psychology. Um, did residency and whatnot. I'm currently with Jefferson Health here in Philadelphia. So the realm of psychology clearly is very different, but I also feel like it's some degree of continuity for my interest in patristics, particularly interest in Augustine,
Mm.
sometimes regarded as the first psychologist in the West. He's reflexive, talks about himself and the introspection of his own life and his actions. A work like Confessions is sentinel in the history of Western civilization for that reason. There's nothing like that prior to it.
I've read that it's our first autobiography.
Yeah, in the truest sense of it.
Hmm.
And he uses God as this mirror where he's able to reflect back himself. In fact, he talks about that significantly in book 11 of Confessions. Lord, let me know you that I might know me.
Mm.
Um, Trying to be able to find the application for that is always a challenge. Trying to be able to translate, uh, not necessarily linguistically translate, but translate the world of patristics and the ancient wisdom that comes along with it to a modern audience who might be able to receive it. Uh, that's a professional end there. Uh, I'm open to any suggestions on that account.
Well, I mean, this might even start just a little more base, but I mean, I see the kind of the wall of work, and of course, this will be linked, and I definitely want people to go through. And even as we were talking about for the past couple of weeks, I know some people who, if they're not already using this, I'm sure would be very curious in uncovering. This might be a funny question to ask one who's doing this kind of work, but I mean, I think this almost, how do I say this? Considering how much time you spend in the world of antiquity and into the high middle ages, it's almost like the desk side of Indiana Jones in my mind, if that if that makes sense, right? But I mean, it could be very real, but like I see obviously like there is a great uncovering of the ancient world here and the ancient church, and that needs to be preserved, right? It belongs in a museum. So have you, for your own work, has there been something that has been the most illuminating, maybe even, I was going to say fun, but I'm trying to use a different word, but kind of an illuminating thing, or something that actually has helped you maybe connect, whether it's to Augustine or maybe to another patristic father that you've uncovered, that you've been like, ah, got it, okay.
So I guess since childhood, I was always very interested in maybe the additional details of the life of Christ. The Gospels give their accounts, they're incredibly valuable, but every so often, patristic authors they drop these little hints, and it's very curious because you kind of wonder like, okay, where did you get that from? So for me, what's been a long-standing interest is the family of Christ itself. So Mary, Joseph, the alleged brothers and sisters, Cleophas, who's usually regarded universally as an uncle, presumably the brother of Joseph. But what was Christ's family life really like? What was
Mm.
it like to be in Nazareth in the first century? Now, every so often, the church fathers will give you a taste of that, like with Justin Martyr, where he says that the family, yes, they were tectons, they were carpenters, but they made plowshares. Now, that's a very specific detail
Yeah.
that you only find, and sometimes you feel like, okay, it sounds like you probably know more about that. There's this wish that, like, I wish you could expand upon this. I know you've been dead for 18 centuries. Ever so often, there's a line that's really intriguing, and you're right to kind of pull from the Indiana Jones analogy here that these are treasures that have otherwise been relatively neglected. We should be talking about them more. We should be able to be kind of going into the original texts as primary sources. It's just the barrier that has existed historically. So in something like that, the question of the family of Christ, one of the big disputes with both Protestantism and in the Orthodox world is who are these brothers and sisters? Because the Greek text itself in the New Testament says, "Hoadelphoi," brothers. So who are they? Because the long-standing church tradition speaks of Mary and her perpetual virginity going back to Ignatius in
Hmm.
the tail end of the first century. So we have a fairly old tradition here. There are quite a few church fathers that do discuss Christ's family. but no one really talks about them to any length. So someone like Epiphanius, the 4th century bishop of Salamis, says that yes, they are brothers, but they're not full brothers. They're half brothers through Joseph from a previous marriage. And he goes as far as to mention Christ's sisters by name, Mary and Salome, which is the oldest reference that we have to any kind of name associated with them. Other ones, like there's a Coptic text. It's very interesting. It's the origin of our tradition about Joseph's extreme old age, where it claims that he died at the age of 110, which is quite an accomplishment if it's true.
Wow.
But it comes from the 6th century, so anybody's bet is off. But a lot of the things that we talk about and that we sometimes see represented in church art, that's fairly important. A lot of laymen just don't understand where it's coming from. Where are the points of tradition? They're just not sourced randomly. They're coming from a specific place. And the Protestant world usually jumps on this, claiming that all of these things are illegitimate because they're just random. But we are pulling them from somewhere. They're not being taken out of the air.
I want to pick up on that end that you just said there, because in our lovely contemporary time, there's a lot of good that's happening. For instance, the fact that you can assemble all your work and you have a very nicely laid out website, and boom, I can access it, no problem. But at the same time, I was just talking to some friends, and later this in the new year, I'm going to probably do an episode talking really about sacred architecture with an architect, because I've heard a great analogy of the gospel of the poor, right? The idea that one doesn't have to, and especially for most of church history, right? One didn't have to be formally educated to understand a lot of the tradition and where it comes from. So, for instance, in the medieval period, you could have had someone go into a really pretty Gothic church and look up peasants who don't particularly know their Latin or Greek and say, well, that's St. Peter, because no matter how he's depicted, St. Peter will always be depicted with the keys. St. Bartholomew in his skin, how architecture cranes our eyes up to look towards heaven. And I found, especially with kind of the wave of brutalist architecture and things, even before the council and the changes, a lot of that gospel of the poor was ripped away. And so you go into a church and you try to source out, well, how do I know that that's St. Joseph? And you kind of get 10,000 books thrown at you, as opposed to just being able to produce a statue that demonstrates St. Joseph. So do you find, kind of your work of restoration, what exactly has the church lost, and when did it, this might be funny, when did it start losing it? Right? I mean, you kind of, even when you think about your work from like the High Middle Ages, I read, for instance, a great biography about one of my favorite saints, Sir Thomas More. And one thing that the biography really made a demonstration of is there was a lot of people who say that Luther ushered in, for better or for worse, kind of the modern era. And Thomas More represented kind of the last of the medieval world. There was this sort of order that was passed down to him, and it wasn't just his for the taking, it was more or less for him to accept, while the modern world suddenly says that the prince can choose the religion of his people, and it can be a political, that Luther can side for political means with factions as opposed to their religious good, and that's all well. So to you again, I ask, when did you kind of find, with the history of patristics as we think of it, when did it start to shrink and get scattered a little bit?
So that's a really interesting question, because it's happened, and historically it's happened a lot. So, like, when we talk of the Reformation, the predicate there, the Reformation, is very specific. But the idea of reformatio takes place in every age. The church has had multiple reformations. What makes the Reformation different is the deliberate break, as opposed to the reformations that had taken place under Charlemagne, where there was a clear cleaning house of the Frankish church and trying to reestablish certainly discipline within the Catholic clergy has been a continual issue, past and present, going into things like the Second Council of Lyon, where they had to mandate that all clergy had to be celibate moving forward. There were just too many issues in terms of internal corruption. That was also in the same kind of spirit of Reformation. So there is this element where the church kind of has these high and low points, where things get better, and then they get worse, and then they get better, and then they get worse. I kind of feel like at our current moment, it's probably as bad as it's going to be, and there's nowhere to go but up from here. Hopefully, that's that's the case. But specifically with More and Luther, those are two really interesting characters. So Luther, in terms of ushering in the modern world, absolutely does so. Some of it is political, but the idea that you yourself are capable of interpreting the scriptures, that's the birth of individualism right
Mm.
there. There is no conception of that prior to Luther coming onto the scene. And what results, he wasn't even aware that he was letting the genie out of the bottle with that. He thought, well, I have this other interpretation of scripture, and naturally everyone will see it my way moving forward, and it'll just be as easy as that. And what resulted was 1,000 different interpretations of the New Testament based upon the reading of sometimes nebulous Greek passages, because in Greek, a single word can mean multiple different things. The dispute with the Protestant world, that usually comes up with words like presbyteros, which we translate as priest,
Mm-hmm.
but they'll say it's an elder or a minister, which is theoretically accurate. That is the meaning of the word in Greek. But we have it on a long-standing tradition going back all the way to the very beginning. These individuals are priests, and that we call them priests. No one ever called them elders. No one ever saw them in that term. The unleashing of individualism has radically changed the West in the last 500 years. And we see it developing and maybe even devolving in a very strange way. So in the Protestant world, you had these large communities that were initially very Catholic. I mean, you look at the Church of England, up until fairly recently, it's going to be almost identical to what you would see in most Catholic masses, Catholic parishes. But there's a devolvement from there. Because if you took that idea to its fullest, that everything is just a matter of your own interpretation, then you have what they call constructivism. Everything is a cognitive construct, and there is no sense of reality. And that's exactly what we've seen. We've seen those chickens come home to roost in the sense that everyone has their own sense of reality. Everyone has an idea of what the truth is, this new idea of truth, which is totally separate from the idea of truth as a singular monolithic thing. And as you can imagine, there's a tremendous amount of chaos that comes out of that if everyone is defining reality any way they feel like it. Now, this is kind of a separate soapbox, um, but trying to get back to the idea that was initially laid out. Christianity rose on the premise that there is an eternal truth that's fixed, building on some of the work of Plato, and that it can be known. And if we are able to dedicate ourselves to it, then there's something that we can actually learn. There's some education that's involved in that. If we have the postmodern idea that truth is subjective and that everything is just a matter of constructing your own reality, then education has no point.
Yeah, I could I could completely sign off on it. Uh, and in fact, it was you talk kind of even the devolution that we find in our own age. This is the uptick. Thank God, because I do love what you said earlier that God willing, this might be the worst we've seen in our own time. But yeah, it's not like there's just like one particular point. But when I think about even the sort of work that you do and where you might find it, I'm becoming more and more aware, really specifically through my coming to the traditional Latin Mass was kind of, and I'd already been very history minded, so it was good from that to kind of just dive my toes a little bit deeper into a bit of the patrimony of the church. And from there, I'm beginning to understand that there is a resurgence of things like classical education, for instance. And so I'm sure that some of the work you do doesn't sound, ironically, so foreign perhaps to hopefully as many people whom you might encounter. So do you see a resurgence in the patristics with classical education? Is it being integrated in a way you think is better, or is there still a lot of work to do?
So there's some growth. I've had some classical schools who have reached out to me about my work in particular. Um, some of it is with its accessibility. So there's this there's been this shift in American education in the last century. So it used to be to get into places like, I don't know, Harvard or
Mm-hmm.
Yale, any of the significant universities, the expectation and usually the entrance exam included Greek and Latin.
Yeah.
So it made things easier because you had whole libraries of those schools that were dedicated to those tasks. So we have all of these books that are in Latin, that nobody can read anymore because nobody's been taking the language. There is an interest in going back to that, and it makes sense on the academic level. There's a reason why Latin remains a language of Western science. It's a language that really doesn't belong to anyone anymore specifically. There is no Latin speaking, at least not in a native sense. Um, it has practical utilitarian purpose. But also, there's something about, in the life of the church, the sacredness of an ancient language. It brings you back to a different time and place. It creates a different sense of space. So things like the Latin Mass or the various Latin rites that exist, um, you're creating an atmosphere there of a timeless space, which is really the way that the liturgy is intended to be focused on, rather than trying to be vernacular and accessible to everyone. That's that's not really intended to be what the mystery of the Mass and the consecration is. That's something totally removed from it, at least in my opinion.
No, I think well said. And something even earlier mentioned was, there is this tension because there is, I think, a very natural desire, and I'm seeing it more and more of a return to a sort of understanding across the culture and even across parts of the globe. Um, and at the same time, this sort of assertion, this individual assertion that my culture, my identity ought to trump and even change things of the past. And so when it comes to the liturgy, of course, this is a very, very big debate. And I had a really interesting question a little bit ago from a convert coming up from the South. And he was kind of telling me what it was like to grow up Protestant there. And he asked me sort of what my general take of the Catholic Church was, because the Catholic Church is a bunch of different people who look different and a lot of different cultures. And yet, who does it necessarily belong to? And I said, one of the things I love about the Catholic Church, the analogy I'll give is that of the North American Jesuit martyrs. And so you had these Jesuits, very very hardcore Jesuits from France, cross the ocean, and they found themselves in Huron territory. So what do? But they celebrate the Mass, and then they immediately start on learning Huron so that they can incorporate the language into Christian hymns and these sorts of things. And so while of course it doesn't change the structure, the fundamental nature of the Mass, and certainly at that time with the Mass, how it was celebrated, it was nonetheless very beautiful to see that there is a very natural cultural integration that can happen, even when there is still a kind of a superseding sort of governance of language and tradition over it. And so I do like the idea of, I think it's very natural that you do want to have a basis to be able to know where you're coming from culturally. So there is something really cool about uncovering the Church of Antiquity, the Church of the Middle Ages, the sort of what is it? G.K. Chesterton says that tradition is a democracy of the dead, right? And so, how are we to give our ancestors a vote if we can't understand what they're saying?
Yeah. So getting voice to some of that, um, there is very much this modernist idea that anything that is new is good. This is almost antithetical to that. There's a lot of wisdom that's been passed down in the past that is potentially available to us that we are the heirs to, but we just neglected for whatever reason. And like any kind of renaissance, it requires us to make an additional effort to go into those texts, to go into the past, to maybe be able to discover exactly where we came from. Because we talk about the church in terms of cultural context. It all goes back to this initial root of Galilee, some 20 centuries ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of zigzagged in different directions out of that. So we see the church as brought to by Thomas into India. We see it brought to all of these different people, to the Slavs under the two brothers, Cyril and Methodius, by St. Augustine of Canterbury to the Anglo-Saxons. You mentioned the Jesuit martyrs up in Canada. A lot of those early Jesuit saints, they had a passion, an unbelievable passion to go out places. I'm thinking of both Francis Xavier himself, who went into Japan in the 16th century, something totally unheard of. Japan was almost mythical in the European
Mm-hmm.
imagination. But there was a drive there, and there was a drive to be able to do just that, of taking the gospel and placing it properly in the cultural context. Um, I do really enjoy clearly don't know understand Mandarin Chinese. There's a lot of Jesus sutras, the Gospels as they came into China, initially under the Nestorians, where there's a lot of challenge in terms of the translation that's involved. How do you
Hmm.
talk about the Holy Ghost to a Chinese audience that doesn't even have a word for that? So they'll use phrases like the cool wind. Sometimes it requires a lot of artistry to be able to really nail on the head exactly how that culture is going to respond so that they'll grasp at it. And some of the geniuses that we've seen in the church are really, they gain notoriety because they're able to do that. Famously, Boniface going into Germany, it had to take a specific personality who understood that Germanic mindset to be able to convert them because you just couldn't stick anyone in there. And that's probably a message for our world today. We have an evolving culture which has become potentially very hostile. How do we artfully speak to it without losing the gospel itself?
I heard a homily from one of my priests here in Denver not too long ago. He did the a Fatima pilgrimage, and they started in Spain, and they did, um, and they walked there however many miles to get to Fatima. And something that he told me is he was talking about the sort of Spain has these very very beautiful churches, very very beautiful, old history. Catholicism is one of those things that when it comes to Spain, it's just written into the cobblestones, it's written into the mountains. And he said in his case, he found this being a Latin mass priest, he found the hostility of the clergy and some nuns and so on and so forth in Spain about the traditional Latin mass, and how he found that those who were most willing to allow it to be celebrated were actually like the secular owners of hotels and these sorts of things. All that's to say is this, that one of the analogies or one of the points he was making is that there is this sort of warring identity, certainly in the church and certainly across the culture, of whether we hate who we are or whether we embrace who we are. And so I think that I'm sure in your work that you encounter this, right? Where you said earlier, this modernist idea where if it's new, it's good. And therefore, continuing on, that if it's old, it's bad. And I think that I certainly do encounter. I see that in the college space. I see that in how education. I don't know about you, but I'm a public education kid, and I'm glad I graduated when I graduated. But in retrospect, just thinking about even what does it mean to form people, the philosophy of education was lost. It was a very much an automaton study for the test kind of a way. So you might come out with a high GPA, but you don't know anything about the world and certainly about where you come from and what you need to do. Um, so I wonder if with that all in mind, I do wonder if we are seeing this sort of resurgence as identity has become that important cornerstone. The culture has become highlighted. For the church in particular, I think that this is a sort of moment, and hopefully your work does get easier as it goes forward, because I do kind of see this. I understand this great desire of just being able to say, hey, if you quote, if you quote Saint Augustine, then it's not somehow an indictment. You don't make an enemy automatically just because you're holding on to the voices of the past that are thousands of years ago, but nonetheless still have much to teach us. And honestly, the world has not changed nearly as much, I think, as people think, which is why one could read a text from whatever point, and you have to take those cultural understandings in, I'm sure. But at the same time, the truth is unchanging. And so while it might have to be dressed up and spoken out in a new language every once in a while, the fact that it's unchanging, I think, is probably the most exciting part of your work. That you're uncovering this great font that it's not going to have an end.
Yeah, uh, there really is. I've just kind of skimmed the surface in terms of available texts. It feels seemingly endless. Uh, and there are manuscripts that are out there in libraries, certainly documents even within the Vatican Archives that have just not been touched in centuries, and nobody knows that they're there. So even secular historians have a lot of interest in this kind of work because here's suddenly insight into worlds that have just not been available. Um, I suspect that this will probably consume much of the rest of my life.
Is
Uh,
that the
couple more.
worst thing to happen?
Um, well, it's a mission. I do firmly believe that we have some purpose
Yeah.
that is assigned to us at birth. For whatever reason, this is mine. It is a specific one, but I very much like draw upon the Protestant Reformation analogy, the mindset of Desiderius Erasmus, the great scholar of the 16th century, who shocked the world by putting the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament out there for public use, which doesn't sound like it would be a shocking thing in our modern world, but at the time it was. If we just go back to the original text, the primary sources of our culture, then that's going to be enlightening. I think a lot of the issue that we have in postmodernity is that nobody has any anchor sources here. It's just kind of like whatever I feel, and I'm
Mm.
just reverse engineer that in some way. But important anchor points are kind of they're necessary for any sense of moral development. My reading of the zeitgeist right now is that there has hit a frustration point, that people are interested in anchor points. They're interested in going a little bit deeper rather than the kind of superficiality of public education or even collegiate education in a lot of cases. So why do we believe what we believe, both within Catholicism and as Western civilization in general? If you have moral gripes, where do they come from? Uh, in the past, that was a lot more accessible. But I think a lot of what's driving that is people really wanting some level of depth in their cultural and spiritual life right now.
How do we get you into the Vatican Archives? If you haven't already, I suppose I should say. I mean, maybe this is where you're reporting from now, but how do we get you in? Because I too want to go down there and see some and blow the dust off of some really old manuscripts and have a field day.
Well, that would be fantastic. Um, yeah. So every so often they'll just like trip upon something in the Vatican archives that nobody knew about. There's something about like the Templar order. They were absolved 800 years ago, 700 years ago. Nobody knew about it. Um, and then St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt, enormous library, all of the texts going back to the time of St. Anthony, the famous monastic. Those Egyptian libraries are technically some of the oldest republics in the world, and they all have fantastic collections, which Western scholars have only skimmed the surface of. And Athos in Greece, a lot of the royal libraries. Um, every so often, I get a document or a manuscript that's always fantastic because in the dedication, you know that no one has touched it in several centuries. One of them was dedicated to Queen Christina of Sweden,
Yeah,
who died in 1660. So I'm guessing these aren't heavily trafficked books.
maybe not. Maybe not. That's great. So tell us, especially as we're winding down here, tell me about the best places for someone who's interested. Hey, it's time for me. I want to hop in. I know that you have the website, of course, your Instagram. Are there other places that you have when it comes to your work that we ought to know?
So I think, like on the business end, in terms of distribution, uh, don't want to necessarily support a behemoth like Amazon, but I think most things are accessible through there.
Hmm.
Barnes and Noble, Kobo, Google Books. There's a slew of like minor bookshops that should also carry most of this. In terms of its accessibility, it should be fairly decent, especially in the United States. The United States and the UK, everything should be available for print. It's just a lot of people, it's where to start, how to
Yeah.
navigate a large body of text like that. But if someone's interested, so I was speaking to someone from the Anglican tradition there. Uh, there are a lot of works that survive about what was the foundation of the Anglican Church, uh, specifically in Canterbury, but a lot of questions regarding, like, okay, now that we've created this entity here, we're the Catholic English Church. What does that look like exactly? So there's specific synods that address questions regarding jurisdiction and what does it mean? Um, talking about cultural milieu. So we have the gospel preached here now in Anglo-Saxon. How does that connect to us today? Because that is a very distinctive field. You read the works of Anselm. He's clearly trying to be able to draw how the gospel is pertinent to his own culture and his own time, as we all have to. But his answers are very specific. And a lot of times the language that he uses is very specific to the 11th century that he's writing in, which is chaotic. The political situation that he's under, there's still the Danish question coming in from Canute and the chaos that ensues from that. I would say if someone is very interested in a specific subject within the realm of patristics, to try to narrow it down as best possible, there's no way to be able to consume all of that all at once. It's a little mind-bending at times to be able to just edit it. If you're interested in a particular saint or a particular subject, an area, say interest in a heresy, but how they deal with the question of a heresy, that's probably the best place to begin. So if you're like me, like I was very interested in what did North African Christianity look like after the Arab fall in 699. The answer is there's really not much. We have a few papal letters that say, hey, how's it going? They mention the bishop. They talk about some of the issues that are happening internally as the community slowly shrinks, or has, in a lot of cases, just kind of got up and went to Sardinia. But that's a historical question that's not commonly talked about. It's not something that you'd see in school. It's not something that you would get in a pew or in a Bible study. A lot of them are very specific questions. So that's probably the best place to begin from.
Last question.
Yeah.
If you were taken to the Tower of London a la Thomas More, but you were allowed to bring 3 of the works which you're most proud of, what would that be? And that's all you get before your sham trial and execution for martyrdom, by the way.
I think they took away his books near the end.
They did.
Cromwell was very persistent with that. Maybe it was Cranmere. So I'm particularly proud of. I had to act. I wrote the intro and the commentary and edited it, but Nitholnath did the heavy lifting because it was originally written in Malayalam. It's a Dravidian, a South Indian language.
Whoa.
But it's a song about the life of St. Thomas coming to southern India that has been unknown to the West essentially permanently up until fairly recently. That would be one of them. It's called the Ramban Patu. Ramban is a transliteration of rabbi, the song of the rabbi. Also am proud of my commentary on the Proto-Evangelion James, which is a fairly well-known text. It's just academic theology has a tendency to assume a secular and cynical perspective. I do think that the document is quite old and is coming from distinctively a Jewish priestly tradition, just because of the various commentary and details that are embedded into it. Talk about that quite a bit more, but and third, I do like St. Albert the Great, also known as Albertus Magnus.
Mm-hmm.
He has this great treatise called On Fate, Di Fato. It's a very scholastic work. So he's trying to mix not only biblical theology with Greek philosophy, but he's also been reading a lot of Galen. So there's like a lot of quasi-scientific medical knowledge that's kind of in the mix there. And it's a delight because it's very much the medieval mind. It's something that you wouldn't have. And like in terms of getting a real sense of that, this isn't vetted through a historian. This is the man himself.
Dermot, I can actually say this, and normally this is just a general saying, but with you specifically, you actually are a gentleman and a scholar. So, hey, thanks for popping on. Listeners and viewers, we definitely want to hear from you if you have taken a deep dive or maybe just dipping a slight toe into patristics. We want to know what you're reading and if the Scriptorium project has been or will be helpful for you. Again, go on over to the website, thescriptoriumproject.com, as well as check out his Instagram page, also by the same name. And don't forget, please, to like, comment, and to subscribe. There we go. English is hard. That's why we'll stick to Latin and Greek, right? So we can totally make this way. And hey, if you've been enjoying the show, don't forget also to check us out on Patreon, gladtradpodcast.com/Patreon. Other way around, Jordan. Patreon.com/gladtradpodcast. If you want to go ahead and support the show, we're very, very appreciative of that. And until next time, God bless you and Mary keep you. Adios.